Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to another fun-filled lecture about requirements. This lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about what makes up a good requirement. What words should you use in requirement statements? What words should you avoid? And really help frame out the overall beginning foundations of the requirements. So you've learned why requirements are important, what requirements are, some basics about eliciting requirements, and now we're going to talk about those pieces of requirements. So what makes a good requirement? Well, it's easy. It's that it's allocatable, attainable, complete, concise, consistent, correct, design independent, feasible, measurable, testable, necessary, organized, prioritized, traceable, unambiguous, and understandable. So that's it. So we're just going to complete this lecture. No, I'm just kidding. That is, those are all the great characteristics of what makes a good requirement. And what's funny is I've gotten this from textbooks. They say, what makes a good requirement? And they have this laundry list of characteristics that a requirement should have. Well, that's not my style. I want to give you something that you can remember. Number one, you're not going to remember this laundry list. And something that's actually practical, something you can apply and utilize as you're writing requirements right now and in future projects. So let's get into something that's a little bit easier to remember. So what we actually do here is we borrow SMART. So a lot of people have heard about SMART in regards to goals. Goals need to be SMART. They need to be specific and measurable. They need to be attainable and reasonable and timely, I believe, is kind of the normal SMART breakdown. We borrow that and we adjust it a little bit to make it work for requirements. So again, the acronym is still SMART and it's very similar, but obviously the way it kind of ties in is a little bit different. So when you think about what is a good requirement is a SMART requirement. And what I mean by that is that it's specific. And we'll go into each of these in more detail throughout the next slides, but it's specific, it's measurable, it's attainable, it's reasonable, and it's traceable. So again, we'll go into all the details of this, but just remember, a good requirement is a SMART requirement. So let's jump into specific first. In all of these breakdowns, I have kind of three sections. One is an overall. That's just some details, overall about kind of what it means. Also, what questions to ask. How can you drive out and what questions can you ask yourself to validate that this specific characteristic is being met by your requirement? And then some other guidelines as well. So for being specific, you want the requirement to be overall unambiguous. You want no ambiguity. And what that means is you want it to be very clear. Saying certain words in certain ways can be very confusing. And kind of hopping over to our guidelines, the second bullet point. A calls B, it is updated. Well, you're not saying what's updated, A or B. So that requirement is very ambiguous, meaning that you can't tell what it's actually meaning. It's very general and can be taken out of context. So that's number one. The second thing is consistent. You want to use the same terminology. So the business is going to be using a lot of terminology, and sometimes they're going to say, well, this word means the same thing as this word. I did it in an earlier lecture, non-functional and supplemental. But every time I said supplemental, I was also saying non-functional as a category of requirements, and that's to avoid confusion. I don't want people to get confused on what supplemental is versus non-functional. But you also need to do the same thing when you're going through your requirements. You need to make sure you're using the same terminology to keep it consistent, not only for the business to understand it, but later on then when you translate it into a design document, you don't want people getting confused on the terms. And lastly is simple. You want these requirements to be really clear, short, sweet, specific, simple. Right? Okay, that's specific. So what questions do you ask? The questions are a little general, but what? Why, who, and where? And you're asking yourself, what is it doing? Why is it doing that? Who is doing it? And where is it happening? So if you can ask yourself those questions for every requirement and you can answer that just based on the knowledge you have within that requirement, it's specific. So what are some other guidelines? You want to avoid the words of some, several, and many. When you talk about that, you're using terms that are not specific. You're talking about, well, sometimes it needs to be able to do this. No, you need to say when it needs to do it and when it doesn't need to do it. Very specific. We already talked about kind of the pronouns. Specify the units with numbers. Don't just say, the response needs to happen within 7. 7 what? 7 seconds, 7 milliseconds, 7 hours, 7 days. You need to have the units with any numbers. You want to use pictures. So this is something that you're going to learn as you get into kind of analyzing requirements and specifying requirements and making them more usable and readable. But you want to use pictures to help paint the visual of what that requirement is stating. And then last but not least, you want to provide translations or explanations for terms such as transmitted, sent, downloaded, and processed. When you're saying it needs to be sent somewhere, you need to be specific about where it needs to be sent, when it needs to be sent, how it needs to be sent, etc. So again, you want to be very specific. Next, you want your requirements to be measurable. And what measurable means is you want to be able to measure that progress towards a goal. You want to be able to say, yes, that requirement was met, and here's how we can tell that requirement was met. If you're saying, we want the system to be fast. Okay, well, that's not measurable. We don't know what is fast, and that's a very general term. So you want to say that the response time of the system needs to be that the user needs to get a response within 7 seconds of doing a certain action or whatever. So you need it to be measurable. You want it to be detailed and specific and have some numbers in there. So your indicators should be quantifiable. Ultimately, you want to be able to say that the requirement was successfully met or was not successfully met in the end and during your testing. So what type of questions do you ask? How much? How many? And how will I know when this is accomplished? So if you can say, okay, how do I know when this will be accomplished? Is there a certain thing that happens? Is there a box that pops up? How do I know when the specific requirement is met? So your guidelines. You want to ensure that it's measurable during the requirement elicitation. Don't wait for the testing phase of the project to then go back and say, okay, how can I measure this requirement? You're doing it completely wrong, and it's going to be near impossible for you to validate, because you're going to come up with some measurement that the business may or may not agree to. You want that requirement in itself to be measurable. The next thing is what we kind of talked about. You want to validate the unequivocal success and make sure that can be proven. So you want to be able to say, for sure, this has been met or this has not been met. And then you also want to determine tests that will need to be used to verify the requirement was met. If you're talking response time, you need to be able to say, okay, we need to set up some type of a test to validate this. So as long as you can kind of formulate what that test would be in your head, you don't need to write it down at this point. Might be great to put a little note there. But as long as you can validate or put together a test to be able to do it, that's great. That's what you need to be able to do. Next is attainable. So the overall of this is you want the requirement to be feasible. You want it to be within technical expertise of your company. You want it to be within the scope of the project, and you want it to be within budget. So you're going to get some outlandish, crazy requirements in many different projects. The project may be very simple to create some type of a system to capture some basic data. But when you go in and you start talking to end users or managers, they may have these harebrained ideas that they want certain things to happen, and they want the screen to flash colors when certain actions happen and it alert the user on all this stuff. Well, sometimes you want to just take a step back and say, okay, is this requirement really attainable? So you want a user to be able to smell something when flowers are up on the screen. Okay, well, from a technical standpoint, I don't think smelly monitors are in yet. Maybe they've invented it, but that's likely out of the technical expertise of the project, as well as it's likely out of the scope of the project, and that budget's going to be crazy. So you just want to, what I call sanity check the requirements and validate that they are attainable within the scope of the project, the budget, and the expertise of the business and the people that are going to be working on it. Questions to ask. Is there a theoretical solution to the problem? Can we solve for it? Is there any type of solution that's available? And if you don't know, write the requirement down, but definitely put a little asterisk next to it that it may not be technically feasible, or there may not be a solution to solve for it, because you're not really in the solutioning phase at this point. But a lot of times you can kind of identify those crazy ideas, and maybe there's not a solution for it. Has it been done before? If it has been done before, okay, well, it's probably attainable. Now you can go look at when that was done, what it took, how long it took, the budget and whatnot to determine what is it going to take to replicate. If it hasn't been done before, why not? Is it because nobody's asked for it, or is there some constraints or feasibility issues? And then last but not least, are there any known constraints, whether it's environmental or physical constraints? And what I mean by that is they may want certain things to happen, but because of where that office is located, maybe it can't happen. Maybe they want 1 millisecond response time for their system, but this particular office is located in southern Texas, and the server is located in Seattle, Washington. And so getting a millisecond response time, it's just not attainable. There's no possible way for it to happen. No matter even if you had a streamlined system on fiber optics, it's going to take more than a millisecond to get there and get back. So maybe there's, that's another way to kind of work through that. Some of the guidelines. You want to determine who has responsibility for satisfying the requirement and validate they can deliver. So this kind of comes to the technical expertise. If you're not sure if that requirement's attainable, you're going to want to go talk to your IT experts and find out, is this a path we want to go down? Are we able to achieve this? Also, you want to validate that you have a sufficient time and resources and budget to be able to account for it. They may say, yes, we can do that, but we think to hit that one requirement, it's going to take 100 hours of development, and it's going to take at least 3 weeks for us to get it done. Okay, does that meet within your time constraints, your budget constraints? I don't know. Also, do they have a requirement, or do they have a resource to be able to put on that for 3 weeks? And if they do, when would they be able to get that? So you're just validating that it's going to work there. And also, you want to be able to reuse pieces from previous projects. So like we talked about, if it's been done before, use that, and then you know it's attainable, or at least you know your baseline for what it's going to take to accomplish. Moving into the R of SMART. This is reasonable. So reasonable means that validate that the effort is worth the requirement. So it's very similar to attainable, but you want to ask, is this worthwhile? Is the timing right? Does this match our other efforts and needs? And what I mean by this, is it worthwhile? Maybe that this requirement is going to take a ton of time for you to put together and validate and make sure that this works. And it's only going to gain a user 1 second every month because it's going to save them from having to click a button once a month. Okay, well, now looking at the ROI, we're going to put so many hours into building this, and I'm only going to save a user 1 second a month times number of users times number of months. How long is it going to take for me to get, kind of break even on that cost, which is going to be a long time. So then you probably deem that the requirement's not reasonable, it's not worthwhile. Next, is the timing right? So this will come up sometimes where they want to do a certain requirement, but there may be like a piece to it that is being done in another project or is planned in another project. Is the timing right to complete it here as well? If there's another project happening and that requirement's being sanity checked and it's gone through and it's maybe they're getting into the design and development piece of that requirement, maybe you hold off on the requirement here because the timing's not right. Let's let that project take all of the risk of getting that requirement up and going and see if it's attainable and see if it's reasonable. And then we can then utilize their knowledge. They may fail at it and we can find out why they failed and make sure we go in the right path. Or maybe that project does it successfully and they've got some lessons learned and we can just learn from that and put the requirement in. Or maybe it's not possible. They just deem after a while it's just not feasible. And now you can identify that and you don't have to waste any time, money, or resources on this project, you can just determine that it's reasonable or not reasonable based on that. And then does it match other efforts or needs? This is just kind of saying if this requirement is going to take 2 weeks to create and it's not that important, maybe it's a nice to have, and all the other requirements are taking 2 to 4 hours to complete, you can kind of compare and say, does this really match what we want for the effort? Is the return going to be there? So guidelines, again, this is for reasonable. You're going to run kind of a sanity check, like I said, in the attainable. It's very similar. You just want to validate that it makes sense, that it's worthwhile. And then also you want to ensure the requirement makes sense in the context of what you're doing. So finally, moving into the T, this is traceable. So this, you want to be able to trace the requirement through the design, implementation, and testing. Certain companies and organizations will do this more or less than other companies. So some organizations fully trace a requirement and they're very, very, very stringent about it. They need to know requirement 1.1.4.b is this requirement in the business requirements document. It's this requirement, it matches to this requirement or this piece of the design that then flows through and matches this particular thing that was coded for an implementation and this test case in our testing. Some people trace that out very, very strictly, and that's very costly for them to do. Other ones may have a more of a loose trace, and other ones may have a very little traceability. But it's very important that you, regardless of your organization, at least allow the requirement to be traceable in case it's needed. Even if your organization doesn't trace, you want to be able to write the requirement in a way that it can be traceable all the way through. So what questions can you ask? Can I ensure this requirement has been met in the design solution? So in the business requirements document, you have that requirement written out. Can you validate that in the design solution that's been met? So can you trace it to there? Then next is, can you trace it to the implementation? And finally, can you trace it to the testing? So those are the kind of the rhetorical questions that you'll ask yourself to validate that will work. So some guidelines. You want requirements to have originators, some assumptions, business justifications, dependencies on other requirements, and importance. So what this is saying is, within the requirement, you want to know what requirement this is kind of based off of. Is there another requirement that is the main piece, and this is just a sub requirement? So there's an originator requirement. Is there an assumption being made on this type of requirement on maybe how it's going to be designed or how it'll work in the end, or other assumptions about it? Is there business justification for this particular requirement? Is there a dependency on another requirement? Maybe this is a requirement for a report and it's dependent on this actually being built inside of the system. And then importance, just kind of the priority and just kind of having an understanding of that. So that's the SMART requirements. Specific, measurable, attainable, reasonable, and traceable. A good requirement is a SMART requirement.